HR talent, HR technology, and the workplace. I'm Robin Schooling, and with me today is my co-host, Michael Vandervoort. Our guest and I first talked to each other and met, if you will, about a month or so ago. And so I'm very excited to welcome to the show Patrick Farran, who will be spending the next 30 minutes or so with us. So welcome, Patrick, to Drive Through HR. Absolutely. So as we like to do,
Appreciate the
because we
invitation.
pretend we're
Looking
in
forward to the
HR at
conversation.
the beginning of an interview or something, perhaps, is ask our guest, i.e. you, to tell us a little bit about yourself. Let our listeners know who you are, what you do, where you work, all those good things.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robin. Again, my name is Patrick Farran. I am an executive advisor and a co-founder and CEO of Ad Lucem Group. Ad Lucem is Latin for to the light. I'm also a co-author with my co-founder, Melissa Norcross. We are in the process of launching our book called The Intentional Executive. It's a purpose-driven playbook to help leaders transform their leadership, their team, and their results. Our work focuses on ultimately helping those business owners and C-suite executives navigate that messy reality leading through all the disruption that is out there these days in this world. One thing that's really important to us that these, while rooted in significant research, both my co-founder and I are PhD researchers. We are practitioners first and foremost. We've been in the space for decades, and we have pressure tested these approaches and seen them in other applications. We have had ringside seats to both glorious successes of many of our stakeholders and clients, and also some spectacular failures. And over the years, what we've learned is this, that leaders who thrive aren't necessarily the smartest or most experienced. They're the ones who are, they stay grounded in purpose. They create conditions where their teams can do their best work, and they have the courage to lead differently than everyone else. And that's what Melissa and I wanted to capture in our book, to get this out in the world, help these talented executives avoid the failure that can be avoided for all those preventable reasons that we have seen. So we want to capture the essence of that. And so we're excited to bring some of those snippets here in our conversation together today.
So I have to
go ahead.
No, I was going to say I have to laugh, Patrick, because I work for a consulting firm, and one portion of our practice is leadership, but largely with frontline supervisors, first line supervisors, and employee and labor relations situation. I also just realized that next year I will be hitting my 40th year of working in HR, and I don't know how many millions of books have been written about leadership and how many presentations have been given, and yet we continue to not always get it right.
It is messy for sure. And I'm sure in those 40 years, you have some stories as well.
I have some stories. I'll point you to my LinkedIn page and a series called How Not to Be a Dick. Go read that. It's some of the really bad stories. I love this kind of work because it literally is the front line of issues in the workplace, no matter what level you're at, whether you're a factory employee or in the C-suite, right? Sure. I mean, everybody wants to be led well, et cetera, et cetera. And you talk about champion purpose-driven high-performance leadership. So what's a litmus test for determining whether a leader's purpose is more than a slogan? You mentioned a few things, some of the things they can do, but what else?
Well, I would say it's actually pretty simple, and it's taking a look at what gets rewarded and what gets punished within an organization. Purpose-driven leaders don't just talk about values; they make those hard decisions that align with them, even when it's not convenient and is costly. So when someone violates your stated values but delivers results, do they get promoted, or are they held accountable? Right? When you're under pressure, are you taking those shortcuts, or are you staying true to your purpose? So as we talk about in our book, your culture isn't what's on your walls. It's what you actually do when no one's watching. We'll say that too. I think the other thing I'll add is if your team can't articulate how their daily work connects to your purpose, or if your purpose conveniently shifts based on what's convenient, then I would say it's just a slogan in those instances. But if you're truly aligned with your purpose, it's going to show up in your budget, it's going to show up in your calendar, and it's going to show up in your toughest decisions. I'll give you an example. I had one of my clients a number of years ago. They had a high revenue customer of theirs that it came to his attention that he had berated one of his employees. He had a decision to make, right? Do I tolerate this, right? There's a true financial impact there. And he said the culture he's going to create and so forth, he politely disinvited that client to work with them anymore, right? He said that, and he shared that publicly with his employees that this is not behavior that we culturally tolerate. Conversely, I have had a stakeholder organization with whom I've worked in prior years where they focus, their compensation alignment for their sales team was such that it was
Yep.
kind of revenue at all costs. And the bodies would be left in the wake, so to speak. They got the revenue results, but at what cost? And so the folks who are sort of in that wake realize that this is some culture, toxic culture here that we have to contend with. And so really making sure those are true to
That is such
your
the
alignment
classic
there is
story
really
or
a powerful
situation.
litmus.
And it experienced that my very first in-house HR job was in the banking industry. And I was young and somewhat idealistic and naive and all of those things, and still learning what the world of work was like. And we had our VP, I'll never forget this man, VP of mortgage lending, who, it was sales and, money at all costs. And he did exactly as you said. He left everyone in his wake, from the mortgage loan officers to the mortgage loan processors. I mean, I think once a week I was getting a call because, some mortgage loan processor or an underwriter or somebody was in tears from this man. And it was horrific. And I was
No
there
doubt.
about 5 years. He had been there 10 years before I got there, and he was still there when I left, because what they decided they wanted more than, the sanctity of people's humanity was the revenue he brought in. So there it is. Yep. Although he was very clear
There's your
with what his
litmus.
purpose was, I guess we could say that. Let's talk about aspirations. And so you have a leader who is looking to make some change, maybe make some adjustments. What's the difference between, a commitment or an aspiration? And what are some of those sort of non-negotiable commitments that a leader, an executive who's being intentional should make, especially if they're leading change?
I love the reference to the intentional executive, right? Or, again, that's the title and the sentiment that we're putting forward. And I would say that first, they commit to psychological safety, and that's in essence creating an environment where people can speak up, they can challenge ideas. And they can even fail without fearing retribution. I would say that if you can't navigate change, if your people are afraid to tell you the truth. So I would say that would be the first non-negotiable. Another one that I would add is that and this is something I talk about extensively, is they commit to what we call co-creation rather than edicts. And by that, I mean that people ultimately, the research shows that people support what they help create. So intentional executives involve their teams in shaping the path forward. That can take any number of forms. It's not just so that their team isn't just executing on someone else's vision. I would say that another one I would add is they commit to transparency. And I would say especially the why. To help folks understand what it is and why are we really doing this, what's ultimately the purpose was, because resistance we find comes from uncertainty. So intentional executives are what we say relentlessly clear about the purpose, and they keep communicating that even when it feels repetitive. People need to hear things multiple times in multiple ways. They have all the different modalities, and things don't always stick the first time. So being really clear on that and coming to that. And I would say that finally they need to commit to staying the course on the values, right? Related to our other examples that we talked about, when things get hard, and they will, that's when your team is really watching to see if you're going to compromise and do what you said you did when it really matters. And the moment you don't do that, that's when you've lost them. So I would say these aren't aspirational nice to haves. These are what I would deem the non-negotiables that will ultimately separate those leaders who drive sustainable change from those who create chaos or bodies in the wake, as we talked about.
This is a little bit of a follow-up question on that. Like Robin's example with, revenue at all costs, right? People, whatever that really, that's secondary or tertiary or whatever you rank it in the hierarchy. What are some other what are the elements that people really should focus on, Patrick, to be healthy, right? I mean, non-negotiables, right? I mean, you got to have certain things to make the business run. Otherwise, there's no reason. But what do you? I mean, some say culture, some say money. So, what's your magical blend?
So I think there's a number of things that we want to look at. And one of them is making sure that there is, as I mentioned, the psychological safety, but there's also that understanding. Do people understand where we're going? why it matters, what we're trying to do. And that's not just the executives. Someone on the front lines, can they articulate how their work connects to purpose? There's this anecdotal story. It's probably urban legend, but it's a good story nonetheless. The story, as the story goes, when JFK was touring the NASA Center for when they were getting ready to launch the first moon mission, he encountered a janitor in the hallway and asked him, "What do you do here?" And the janitor's response was, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon," right? And again, whether or not that actually happened is beside the point. The point of that story is that when folks truly connect to their purpose, that becomes a force multiplier. And if they can't, then you've got a clarity problem, not a capability problem. So I would say that's probably a really key fundamental.
Yeah, where I work, we say that we help employers create extraordinary workplaces. That's kind of our goal, and that's our sort of our main core value towards our clients. One of the things that there's this project I was on a few years ago when I was working at a company in Florida. We had a big distribution center, and it was during COVID and grocery industry. So, all that essential worker, nobody could eat out. It changed, it killed everything, right? I mean, there was just work. It was just get the stuff to the stores. But it broke everything else inside the warehouse, right? I mean, they got the job done, but the cost, the human cost, the morale, the rules, the safety, all that stuff went by the wayside. Now, that's a horrible. I mean, they recovered, but it took a while, right? It was a big investment, and it was like turning a battleship to get them refocused because they just got caught up in that one thing. So in the work you do transformation, right? And things can stall. COVID obviously was a, hopefully once in a lifetime event, but there's lots of reasons. We talked some with the guests yesterday about economy, right? Different, AI. I mean, different things come along and bring these big disruptions. So even when you have like a pretty decent system in place, things can still go wrong. So what are I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a lengthy question, but what are the first diagnostic questions someone should ask to find where the real blockage is, whether it's strategy, structure, talent, courage?
Yeah. I think tying back to my comment a moment ago is, first of all, I said, are people clear? Am I clear as a leader? As the rest of our team, are we clear? I would say that would be one key one. I think another one is relatedly to, I think the return to work mandates and so forth that we see in post-COVID is a good example. Is, do we trust folks and give them the agency and the tools they need to work? My brother, who I work with, my practice, has a saying that he'll often say is how it baffles us as leaders that we see organizations time again, they trust their employees to overwork after hours, but suddenly when it's between the hours of 8 and 5, we have to micromanage every move and so forth. So there's a disconnect there, right? So do we trust and empower? I would say another really common staller, if you will, that we want to check for is, are we trying to do too much? Oftentimes we got too many things going. The research shows that starting fewer things actually helps us to get those done better, right? So it's that addition by subtraction, sort of force multiplier there. And I would say that, I guess the final one that I would add is that, tying back to my early comments, what are we actually rewarding? What are those behaviors that we really reward, and how do they align with our values? If we say that innovation matters, for instance, but we're punishing those failed experiments, right? That runs counter to what we're espousing. So I'd say usually if the transformation stalls, it's not that people can't or aren't willing to move forward. It's that the environment we've created is telling them not to.
What do you recommend to force realignment and try to fix things? Because that's a problem we have with leadership. We're always trying to fix it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting word choice, because I would say that we can't force alignment, right? And that's the paradox, right? As much as we'd like to, but we can create the conditions where it organically emerges. I would say that it's really important to start by getting everyone in the room and making the implicit explicit, right? Often misalignment isn't about disagreement on goals, for example. It's about all those unspoken assumptions, all those competing priorities we have, or unclear decision rights, who's in what swim lane and so forth, right? Different work preferences that we're trying to trial and error figure out how to work with one another. So actually putting that stuff on the table is really important. But I would say that another piece that we often work with our clients on alignment, we use a practice called appreciative inquiry, and that's, in short, it's a strengths-based methodology where we ask, when is the organization and the individuals, when have we been at our best? So in this context, we can ask, when have we been most aligned as a team, right? And what made that possible? And then studying from those best examples, instead of looking for all the deficits and all the problems, you say, hey, when we've really performed well in these areas, what can we learn from that? What can we teach? What can that teach us and tell us? And how can we double down on those? And I say another one I would say is get brutally honest about what we call the first team concept. And that is that your leadership team is your first team, not your functional area. So if you're in a senior leadership role, for example, if you're going back to your functional area and everyone's trying to optimize in their own little silos, you'll never align. So you have to create that shared accountability across the organization, which is not just your individual goals, but those collective organizational outcomes that you own together.
Yeah. Um, we uh, we have about 10 minutes left and just a couple questions. So I'm going to go off. I'm going to go off the. We don't really do a script, but we do give the guests prepared questions. So we got a couple of those left. But I'm going to go off down the rabbit hole, as Robin was saying earlier, for a minute. I'm curious. I don't really know what industry sectors you work in. If you specialize, or if you're sort of a generalist and take business as it comes to you, because certainly leadership is universal, although different industries require different types of skill sets. I guess is there I'm curious in your experience, with what you've done, are there certain industries that have a tendency to have different problems or, it's kind of like unusual, like recurring unusual leadership issues? I'm not looking for like horror stories, I guess, but like, does a certain type of situation lead to a peculiar set of problems? I don't think I've ever asked a leadership expert.
That is a really interesting question. And I don't know that I thought about that explicitly. I think my initial response to that is that the reality is, as you've alluded to, we all have sort of core leadership principles and so forth, but they will manifest in different ways. And so I think that's where the nuance. So for example, we don't just focus on nonprofit agencies, for example. We do a lot of nonprofit work. And so you think about there are some common challenges in the nonprofit industry in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how they fundraise, for example, and how that manifests in terms of donor relations and so forth. And there's going to be different nuance when you might have a for-profit organization who still needs to make sales and do business development. So similar kinds of problems that they have to solve. But the way it shows up or the way it surfaces, I'll give an example. We had a leader who a number of years ago was feeling anxious. And that's one of the things as leaders sometimes we do is we have that tendency then to take more control over things instead
Mm-hmm.
of working with our team. And they took over one of their key fundraising events as a newer leader in there. And they stopped getting input from those experts on their own team that knew the most about that
Mm-hmm.
particular event. And so I see that dynamic commonly, but in that particular context, that created some unique challenges and outcomes from that segment. So I don't know that offhand, there's necessarily a universal difference, if you will, but there are definitely the ways they show up and manifest will have different nuance, I guess would be my thought.
I had an interesting, I don't know, 18 months or so where I transitioned from a job and moved to a new state.
Mm-hmm.
And for the only time in my career, didn't have another job to go to. So I was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, so I wound up doing some consulting with a privately operated, a company that operates prisons, but it's a private company that operates prisons on behalf of the federal government, state government, or whatever. And you can imagine, people coming out of law enforcement background running prisons, it was not the most, open and welcoming leadership simply because of the industry that they do. And that's kind of what got me on the question. And then I went from there to back-to-back jobs, actually over a little bit more than 18 months. It was probably more like 2 years where I worked for two companies that were like on the great place to, a great place to work list, right? So the contrast of kind of going from that command and control to like, let's do everything that we can to make our people say, wow, or that wasn't really the mission, but that's what it felt like, it was almost jarring to me, but it taught me very clearly at that point 20 years ago that the culture that you pick for where you work and the way it's led is super critical.
For sure.
And anyway, so companies, how they invest is super intriguing to me.
Well, and you pick an interesting point that a command and control culture can extend multiple industries. Like, I mean, some of them may be
Yeah.
more prevalent per se. Those tend to have, in my experience, a higher degree of sort of toxic behaviors for many of the reasons because it
Mm-hmm.
runs counter to all the positive psychology and research that shows the benefits of more inclusive practices and more egalitarian types of practices. But that doesn't mean that I have seen and been in top places to work, right? It doesn't mean that there's not some of those same toxic behaviors that
Yeah.
show up in
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
organizations either.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always say just one manager and maybe having a bad time in their personal life after 20 years of great work, they go through a divorce and you can go off the road into a ditch and turn into a problematic man. Anyway, to wrap up, got a couple last questions. So let's hit those. On an individual basis or with an individual leader, you emphasize getting a new daily routine. So what does that reset look like in action? Is it, different, run a meeting differently? One decision? What do you do there?
Yeah, and I think that can take a couple of different formats, but the reset ultimately starts with how you structure your time. So in our book, we talk about the importance of intentionally mapping your key relationships as well as the touch points for the year, and then actually scheduling them, right? What's common for many leaders is we let the urgent crowd out the important, right? So we never ultimately invest in those strategic relationships that matter. So I think the same thing applies to making time for key strategy, blocking time and treating that time as non-negotiable so we can have that important think time, just like you would a board meeting or a client meeting, and treating that as with a similar level of commitment. One other simple practice that I'll offer when it comes to meetings, for instance, we could talk about meetings, so that could be a whole separate conversation, but
Another book.
for sure, exactly. There you go. But one very simple but profound practice that you can do is starting out your meetings with a connection back to purpose. Not as a platitude. It could be a story for the week. It could be, we worked with organizations that put up their mission statement again, and they'll talk about what's one way that you've experienced this. It could be a question or two just to start in those first couple of minutes, because it sets the tone. It recenters the conversation for why we're doing that and keeps folks aligned. So it's a really simple practice that I'll offer as one.
Yeah, it may not be exactly on point to like how you just described it, but every meeting that we have, and we do a once a week staff meeting, for our whole team, which is small, 15 people, and then we have subsets. But at every one of those meetings, we always have what's the question of the day? And sometimes it's like, what's your favorite snack? Last week it was what's your favorite dish at Thanksgiving? But we just share, and it connects you at the table. Then we review our BHAG, our big hairy ass goal for the year. And then we go into the agenda, right? And sometimes I think, oh, we're doing this again,
It resets,
but it really
and it
does
humanizes. It humanizes it.
It does. It humanizes the meeting, and I always learn something about my coworkers that I didn't know, and we always get a laugh out of it. It is it's a very simple game changer.
Yep.
Find it super intriguing.
For sure.
I would never have thought of that on my own.
Could I offer one other suggestion, and that's for leaders? And this is regarding one behavior to stop that many of us fall prey to, and that is stop trying to be the answer person.
Mm-hmm.
And that has multiple benefits, because first of all, it's liberating to you as a leader, not having to put on the facade that you know all the answers. But more importantly, think about when someone brings you a problem, if you can resist the urge to solve it, instead you can ask them, what are a few solutions or ideas that you've considered? You are in turn building their capability and empowering them and giving them agency, and you're freeing your time up from being that bottleneck, right? So that's one it's easier said than done, but it's the kind of thing where you build that habit that is a true force multiplier. So I really want to encourage that for our listeners as well.
I've been receiving, you may have seen me furtively looking at I know we're on camera, but we don't do a video cast, so people can't see it. I've been checking my phone because my co-host disappeared. Well, her server apparently went down and she's trying to get that fixed, but I don't think we're going to see her before we come back. So on behalf of Robin, I want to thank you for being a guest on Drive Through HR today, Patrick. To wrap up, I guess 3 things. Tell people where they can find you, whether that be LinkedIn or other socials. Any contact info, we'll put all this in the show notes too, by the way. And then tell us when the book's coming out.
Well, LinkedIn, I'm active on LinkedIn, so you connect with me there, Patrick Farran, Farran. If you send me a connection request, just put a little note in there that you heard me on the podcast, so I don't think you're spam. My website as well, adlucemgroup.com, ADLUCEMGROUP. We've got a bunch of free resources. We've got a book launch page that's attached there. We're aiming to launch our book January 22nd is our target date. So more to come there. There's a wait list you can sign up for and a bunch of free resources. Very happy to do resources if this sparked any questions or follow-ups for folks. I'll listen to you today.
Nice. Well, congratulations. I write a lot, but I've never written a book, and Robin just did, and I don't think it's in my future.
It was a long slog. It's been 10 years in the making for us, and I don't know, honestly, I would have gotten over the finish line if it was just me. So Melissa did a great lift with me.
Well, congratulations on that. Thanks for being on the show today,
pleasure. Thank
you. We will catch you on the flip side.
Thanks, Michael.